When historians recount what happened in San Francisco during 1906, they concentrate on the surface-level disaster, the devastating earthquake that hit at 5:12 in the morning, the fires that ravaged the city for 3 straight days, and the destruction that reduced more than 400 blocks to rubble. However, the actual story, the one that scarcely made it into reconstruction documents and still remains tucked away in municipal footnotes even now, started underground. The whole thing kicked off with an enormous cleanup effort. City engineers received orders to remove debris throughout the destroyed city, haul away rubble from collapsed structures, and get the ground ready for San Francisco's bold reconstruction plans. With the entire nation watching the city emerge from the ashes, the objective was straightforward: stabilize the ground, evaluate the damage, and figure out whether the land could handle the weight of a rebuilt urban center. Yet the instant workers started digging through the wreckage, something totally unexpected occurred. They penetrated through layers that hadn't seen daylight in decades, going beneath the 1906 rubble and deeper than anyone had predicted. The work crews discovered tunnels and chambers that didn't correspond to any recognized infrastructure. Their size was enormous, their construction was peculiar, and the stonework bore no resemblance to anything in San Francisco's recorded past. It didn't even look like the Victorian-era construction that supposedly characterized the city. None of this got mentioned in public reconstruction documents, and it never appeared in newspapers covering the rebuilding efforts. But within that year's internal notes, one particular phrase keeps showing up repeatedly: pre-existing tunnels, unexpected depth, origin unknown. The official version would eventually reduce all of this to old sewer lines, forgotten mining tunnels, or just misidentified earthquake damage. Nothing unusual, nothing warranting discussion. However, the survey photographs from that period, the ones developed in dim municipal offices while San Francisco rebuilt itself, reveal something entirely different. They capture workers positioned next to brick-lined passages, constructed with precision far exceeding anything in the city's official construction records. Tunnels spacious enough to drive carriages through yet missing from every map. Arched corridors assembled so expertly that even in the grainy quality of early 1900s, photography, the craftsmanship stands out clearly. Drainage systems carved into bedrock that don't show up in any city planning document. And the deeper they excavated, the more these layers stopped resembling Victorian infrastructure and started looking like infrastructure that had been constructed over, buried, and intentionally forgotten. Initially, the cleanup teams attempted to classify everything in the most basic terms possible: old utility tunnels, abandoned mine shafts, natural fissures created by the earthquake. But as notes piled up and more passages came to light, the contradictions grew. Why were some tunnels built on a scale far exceeding anything San Francisco required during the 1800s? Why were certain sections lined with brick laid so precisely that modern engineers still can't figure out the technique? Why did some corridors stretch beneath areas that were supposedly untouched hillside before American settlement arrived? And the question that bothered even the most conventional city planners: why were these deeper tunnels so intricate? The reconstruction demanded exact surveys of ground stability, yet the underground infrastructure beneath portions of downtown, North Beach, and the financial district seemed designed for a city much larger and much older than the San Francisco of public records. Cleanup teams quietly acknowledged among themselves that the depth and scale didn't align with any construction timeline they recognized. And while none of them used phrases like hidden history, they were admitting something equally disturbing. Someone had built beneath this ground before, not simple tunnels, not basic mine shafts, but a network. As documentation accumulated, so did the silence. Reports grew shorter, descriptions turned vague, photographs stopped capturing the full scope of the passages, and then the excavation areas were hurriedly sealed again in late 1906 and early 1907, packed with earthquake rubble, covered with fresh construction, and much of what had been exposed was returned to darkness. Only fragments survive. Notes, a small collection of photographs, and the quiet accounts of city workers who witnessed the tunnels before certain sections were permanently shut. But even from what remains, a pattern emerges. Passages too complex for San Francisco's known history. Brickwork too sophisticated for the accepted timeline. Construction methods that appear inherited. Infrastructure that seems to belong to an entirely different building era. When reconstruction teams pushed past the initial recognizable layers beneath the ruined city, expectations were simple. They figured they'd encounter earthquake damage, maybe some old basement foundations and scattered remnants from early gold rush construction. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable. But within weeks, that assumption shattered, because instead of a clean sequence of collapsed buildings and natural bedrock, teams uncovered a stack of infrastructure layers that didn't behave like normal city layers should. The first irregularity involved alignment. Each layer, post-earthquake, pre-earthquake, Victorian, and whatever existed beneath, appeared to follow the same grid, the same orientation, the same geometric pattern. Different eras shouldn't do that. Different city planners, different construction companies, different decades don't build in perfect alignment with infrastructure buried meters below them. Yet beneath San Francisco, they did. Tunnels from one era ran directly above tunnels from another. Passages lined up with passages buried far below them. Drainage systems shared identical trajectories even when separated by unknown decades or centuries, as if every group that ever built on this soil was following an original city plan that no longer existed in any archive. As workers dug deeper, the layers grew stranger. Beneath the expected Victorian-era brick and timber, they started encountering stonework that resembled nothing from 19th century construction. Much larger passages, much tighter brickwork, systems that seemed too mathematically exact for anything in San Francisco's documented timeline. Some tunnels appeared almost overbuilt, perfectly arched chambers with flawless curvature crafted with precision that didn't match Gold Rush-era California construction methods. Then came the discovery that confused even the most seasoned engineers. Entire sections of the deepest tunnels were packed with hardened mud and sediment, compressed so densely it required days to excavate layer upon layer of compacted earth, as if these passages had been intentionally buried or had been submerged and filled naturally over time. Yet there's no historical record of San Francisco experiencing flooding severe enough to fill underground tunnels to this depth. No map showing ancient waterways beneath these specific locations. Nothing explaining why large sections of the deepest infrastructure look like they'd been deliberately entombed beneath layers of mud and debris. Survey photographs taken in 1906 and 1907 demonstrate this clearly. Workers standing beside passages so enormous that men appear small by comparison. Brickwork laid so precisely that even today engineers examine the archival images in disbelief. Arches and joints that resemble infrastructure far older and far more advanced than anything Gold Rush San Francisco is credited with. But the most disturbing detail wasn't what showed up in the photographs. It was what didn't appear in the archives. Official reconstruction reports written in the years following the earthquake barely reference these features. Some drawings omit the deepest tunnels completely. Certain infrastructure layers are summarized with vague terms like pre-existing utilities or earlier construction, even though photographs prove they were far more elaborate than that. The silence is difficult to overlook because if these deeper layers truly belong to known historical periods, why weren't they described thoroughly? Why weren't the unusual construction techniques documented comprehensively? Why were the photographs scattered across city archives instead of compiled into one comprehensive municipal report? Even some of the brickwork raised concerns. Joints too tight, surfaces too smooth, patterns too uniform, marks that resemble less like hand-laid brick and more like mass-produced precision construction. Construction that, according to conventional timelines, didn't exist when those tunnels were supposedly built. What reconstruction teams unearthed was infrastructure that didn't match Gold Rush construction, didn't match Victorian engineering, and didn't even match itself across different depths. Instead, it formed a strange architectural language, one that seemed to emerge from multiple eras, yet somehow remained unified, aligned, and impossibly sophisticated. The first shock arrived with the chambers themselves. These weren't crude mining tunnels or narrow utility passages. They were perfectly vaulted spaces, rooms shaped with exact proportions, arches that maintained their curve flawlessly across decades, and brick vaults arranged with coherence almost like remnants of a master infrastructure plan that no longer exists in any archive. Some chambers were completely sealed, packed with compressed mud so dense that workers assumed they'd struck solid bedrock. But once opened, they revealed interiors that looked untouched since the day they were closed. Smooth walls, fitted brick, and construction patterns that raised more questions than answers. Then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today: the giant circular access shafts. Officially, they were later classified as old wells or natural sinkholes, but nothing about them fits typical well design or geological formation. These were too symmetrical, too deep, and too perfectly cylindrical, as if they were cut with tools capable of maintaining flawless roundness for dozens of meters down. Some shafts were wide enough for multiple workers to descend side by side. Others narrowed gradually, almost like ventilation systems or mechanical access points for machinery. Workers from 1906 described them in private correspondence as engineered vertical passages, not wells, but structures with intentional purpose, though nobody could determine what that purpose might have been. Another irregularity appeared in the placement of certain support structures. These weren't simply holding up the streets above. Many were positioned in ways that made zero engineering sense for Victorian San Francisco. Massive brick pillars supporting sections that seemed to need no reinforcement. Foundation walls extending far beyond the footprint of any documented building above them. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The city above ground may not simply rest on natural bedrock. It may sit on something much larger, an infrastructure whose extent was never recorded, never mapped, and never explained in San Francisco's official history. The deeper workers dug, the stranger the findings became. Brick tunnels appeared with perfectly straight walls. Some surfaces were glazed, smooth, almost reflective. Others showed precision-cut passages so uniform that modern construction engineers still debate what methods could have produced them. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was the presence of metal rails embedded in tunnel floors that supposedly predated any rail system in San Francisco. Some rails looked corroded, rusted, or fused to the brick, yet they were found in layers supposedly older than the city's first streetcar lines. The official explanation offered later: abandoned mining cart tracks, forgotten industrial remnants. But that doesn't explain why the rails appear in tunnels beneath areas never documented as mining sites, and why they run in organized patterns, not randomly placed, but aligned like the infrastructure of a transit system that was never officially built. Soon after these discoveries, something unusual started happening. Tunnels were sealed again, passages were filled, deep sections of the sites were cut off from further exploration. Some of this was officially labeled as structural safety concerns necessary to prevent collapses during reconstruction. But the decisions about which tunnels to seal first and which areas to bury permanently raised quiet questions among observers because the passages that were closed immediately were always the ones that challenged the official timeline the most. The perfectly vaulted chambers, the massive circular shafts, the unexplained rail systems, the elaborate brick corridors that seemed to continue far beyond the excavation zone. These tunnels were perhaps the most mysterious find of all. They weren't random passages. They were part of an organized network, a grid of infrastructure that looked less like improvised mining tunnels and more like a planned city beneath the city. Aligned, measured, systematic, as if they once connected to a much larger underground system, one that stretched beneath San Francisco long before any city we acknowledge ever existed on the surface. And yet, almost as soon as they were uncovered, many were sealed again. Their entrances blocked, their purpose unexplored, their existence quietly removed from subsequent city maps. When you examine the final months of the 1906 reconstruction excavations, something becomes impossible to ignore. The projects didn't end naturally. They were stopped, not completed, not concluded, stopped. The deeper the cleanup teams went, the more the tone of their notes shifted. Early entries were matter-of-fact, almost routine, but by mid-1907, the language becomes cautious, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else suddenly controlled what could be written down. And this is where the final mystery begins, because the last tunnels they opened beneath San Francisco weren't ordinary. They weren't Victorian utilities. They weren't gold rush remnants. They weren't even identifiable. They were something else entirely. Multiple reports, the few that survived, described brickwork that suddenly shifted from the familiar to the unexplainable. Walls with joints so tight you couldn't slide paper between them, vaulted ceilings shaped with precision that pre-modern San Francisco was never supposed to possess, foundation systems built for loads far heavier than anything documented above them, and corridors that extended beyond the excavation zone, disappearing beneath modern buildings into unexplored darkness. But here's the part that always gets buried. The most elaborate tunnels were the ones that were filled in first. Workers described sealing entire passages, blocking entrances, packing earthquake rubble into spaces that had just been uncovered. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate. The official explanation: earthquake damage, safety concerns, reconstruction priorities. But if it was only about safety, why were the oldest, cleanest, most structurally sound tunnels the ones sealed first? And why were the most damaged sections left exposed for documentation? It doesn't make sense unless those deeper layers posed a different kind of threat. Not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the infrastructure beneath San Francisco truly showed construction techniques beyond gold rush capability, and if some of those passages didn't match any known city plan at all, then the entire accepted story of San Francisco's founding begins to collapse. Imagine what it would mean if modern San Francisco were built on top of something far older, something massive, something engineered, something we didn't build. Imagine what it means if the mud-filled tunnels weren't natural flooding, but deliberate attempts by later peoples to hide or repurpose what came before. And maybe that's why the 1906 discoveries were quietly reburied, not to protect the sites, but to protect the narrative. The surviving photographs tell their own story. Workers standing next to passages that look almost industrial, arches that resemble modern engineering, drainage systems too sophisticated for their supposed age. These aren't the kinds of discoveries historians like to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to talk about at all. And that brings us to the final question. Why was the deepest evidence, the earliest infrastructure, the most advanced layers sealed away again? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The perfect brickwork was buried. The giant circular shafts were buried. The unexplained rail systems were buried. The elaborate vaulted chambers were buried. The organized tunnel networks were buried, and even parts of the photographic record vanished. Almost as if the excavation had accidentally revealed a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than the gold rush, older than American settlement, older than the narrative we were given. And for one brief moment in 1906, the earthquake opened the ground just enough to show it. But instead of studying it, they closed it again, sealed it, filled it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if San Francisco stands on top of infrastructure built by a civilization we no longer acknowledge, then the real question isn't what was discovered in 1906. It's what else lies beneath the cities of the world. What other tunnels, what other networks, what other layers were quietly reburied long before cameras existed? The 1906 excavation wasn't just earthquake cleanup, it was a glimpse, a brief accidental glimpse into a version of history we were never meant to see. Where are you watching this video from? Write in the comments which city or country you are from. We would love to know who is watching with us. Share your thoughts, observations, or questions. Every comment is important. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new videos. Together, we are creating a community of curious explorers.